minds need these qualities, but how are they to be brought up and educated? If we try to answer this question, I wonder whether it will help us at all in our main inquiry into the origin of justice and injustice. We do not want to leave out anything relevant, but we don't want to embark on a long digression. To which Adeimantus replied, I expect it will help us all right. Then, my dear Adeimantus, we must certainly pursue the question, I rejoined, even though it proves a long business. So let us set about educating our guardians as if we had as much time on our hands as the traditional storyteller. Let us, by all means. What kind of education shall we give to them then? We shall find it difficult to improve on the time-honoured distinction between the training we give to the body and the training we give to the mind and character. True. And we shall begin with the mind and character, shall we not? Of course. In this type of education you would include stories, would you not? Yes. These are of two kinds, true stories and fiction. Our education must use both and start with fiction. I don't understand you. But you know that we begin by telling children stories. These are, in general, fiction, though they contain some truth. And we tell children stories before we start them on physical training. That is so. That is what I meant by saying that we start to train the mind before the body. And the first step, as you know, is always what matters most, particularly when we are dealing with those who are young and tender. That is the time when they are taking shape, and when any impression we choose to make leaves a permanent mark. That is certainly true. Shall we therefore allow our children to listen to any stories written by anyone, and to form opinions the opposite of those we think they should have when they grow up? No, we certainly shall not. Then it seems that our first business is to supervise the production of stories, and choose only those we think suitable and reject the rest. We shall persuade mothers and nurses to tell our chosen stories to their children, and so mould their minds and characters rather than their bodies. The greater part of the stories current today we shall have to reject. Which are you thinking of? We can take some of the major legends as typical, for all are cast in the same mould and have the same effect. Do you agree? Yes, but I'm not sure which you refer to as major. The stories in Homer and Hesiod and the poets, for it is the poets who have always made up stories to tell to men. Which stories do you mean, and what fault do you find in them? The worst possible fault, I replied, especially if the story is an ugly one. And what is that? Misrepresenting gods and heroes like a portrait painter who fails to catch a likeness. That is a fault which certainly deserves censure, but give me more details. Well, on the most important of subjects, there is first and foremost the foul story about Uranus and the things Hesiod says he did, and the revenge Kronos took on him. While the story of what Kronos did, and what he suffered at the hands of his son, is not fit to be repeated as it is to the young and innocent, even if it were true, it would be best to say nothing about it, or, if it must be told, to tell it to a select few under oath of secrecy, at a rite which required, to restrict it still further, the sacrifice not of a mere pig, but of something large and expensive. These certainly are awkward stories, and they shall not be repeated in our state, Adeimantus, I said. Nor shall any young audience be told that anyone who commits horrible crimes, or punishes his father unmercifully, is doing nothing out of the ordinary, but merely what the first and the greatest of the gods have done before. I entirely agree, said Adeimantus, that these stories are unsuitable. Nor can we permit stories of wars and plots and battles among the gods. They are quite untrue, and if we want our prospective guardians to believe that quarrelsomeness is one of the worst evils, we must certainly not let them embroil the rose with the story of the battle of the giants, or tell them tales about the many and various quarrels between gods and heroes and their friends and relations. On the contrary, if we are to persuade them that no citizen has ever quarrelled with any other because it is sinful, our old men and women must tell children stories with this end in view from the first, and we must compel our poets to tell them similar stories when they grow up. But we can permit no stories about Hera being tied up by his son, or Hephaestus being flung out of heaven by his father for trying to help his mother when she was getting a beating, or any of Homer's battles of the gods, whether their intention is allegorical or not. Children cannot distinguish between what is allegory and what isn't, and opinions formed at that age are usually difficult to eradicate or change. It is therefore of the utmost importance that the first stories they hear shall aim at producing the right moral effect. Your case is a good one, he agreed, but if someone wanted details and asked what stories we were thinking of, what should we say? To which I replied, My dear Adeimantus, you and I are not writing stories but founding a state, and the founders of a state, though they must know the type of story the poet must produce and reject any that do not conform to that type, need not write them themselves. True, but what are the lines on which our poets must work when they deal with the gods? Roughly as follows, I said. God must surely always be represented as he is, whether the poet is writing epic, lyric, or drama. He must. And the truth is that God is good, and he must be so described. True. But nothing good is harmful, or can do harm, and what does no harm does no evil, nor can a thing which does no evil be the cause of any evil. That is true, and what is good is of service and a cause of well-being. Yes. So the good cannot be the cause of everything. It can only account for the presence of good and not for evil. Most certainly, he agreed. Then God, being good, cannot be responsible for everything, as is commonly said, but only for a small part of human life, for the greater part of which he has no responsibility. For we have a far smaller share of good than of evil, and while we can attribute the good to the God, we must find something else to account for the evil. I think that's very true, he said. So we cannot allow Homer or any other poet to make the stupid mistake about the gods, or say that Zeus has two jars standing on the floor of his phallus, full of fates, good in one and evil in the other, and that the man to whom Zeus allots a mixture of both has varying fortunes, sometimes good and sometimes bad, while the man to whom he allots unmixed evil is chased by the gadfly of despair over the face of the earth. Nor can we allow reference to Zeus as dispenser of good and evil, and we cannot approve if it is said that Athene and Zeus prompted the breach of solemn promises by Pandarus, or that the strife of the goddesses and the judgment of Paris was due to Themis and Zeus. Nor again can we let our children hear from Aeschylus that God implants guilt in man when he wishes to destroy a house utterly. No, we must forbid anyone who writes a play about the sufferings of Niobe, the subject of the play from which these last lines are quoted, or the woes of the house of Pelops, or the Trojan War, or any other similar topic, to say that they are acts of God. Or, if he does, he must give the sort of reason we are now demanding, and say that God's acts were good and just, and that the sufferers were benefited by punishment. What the poet must not be allowed to say is that those who were punished were made wretched through God's action. He may refer to the wicked as wretched because they needed punishment, provided he makes it clear that in punishing them God did them good. But if our state is to run on the right lines, we must take every single possible step to prevent anyone, young or old, either saying or being told, whether in poetry or prose, that God, being good, can cause harm or evil to any man. To say so would be sinful, inexpedient, and inconsistent. I should approve of a law for this purpose, and you have my vote for it, he said. Then, of our laws laying down the principles which those who write or speak about the gods must follow, one would be this: God is the source of good only. I am quite content with that, he said. And what about our second law? Do you think God is a kind of magician who can appear at will in different forms at different times, sometimes turning into them himself and appearing in many different shapes, at other times misleading us into the belief that he has done so? Or is he without deceit, and least likely of all things to change his proper form? I don't, at the moment, know what the answer to that is. Well, if he does change his proper form, must not the change be due either to himself or to another? It must. so. And characters which have most courage and sense are least liable to be upset and changed by external influences. And similarly, any composite object, a piece of furniture, or a house or a garment, is least subject to wear if it is well made and in good condition. That is true. So in general, whether a thing is natural or artificial, or both, it is least subject to change from outside if its condition is good. So it seems, but the state of God, the divine, is perfect, and therefore God is least liable of all things to be changed into other forms. That is so. Then will God change or alter himself of his own will? If he changes at all, he replied, that must be how he does. Will the change be for the better or for the worse? Any change must be for the worse, for God's goodness is perfect. You are absolutely right, I said. And, that being so, do you think that any man or God would deliberately make himself worse in any respect? If you agree that this is impossible, then it must also be impossible for a God to wish to change himself. Every God is as perfect and as good as possible, and remains in his own form without variation forever. The conclusion is unavoidable. So we cannot have any poet saying that the gods disguise themselves as strangers from abroad and wander around our towns in every kind of shape. We cannot have stories about the transformations of Proteus and Thetis, or poets bringing Hera on the stage disguised as a priestess paying alms for the life-giving children of Inachus, river of Argos. We must stop all stories of this kind, and stop mothers being misled by them, and scaring their children by perversions of the myths, and telling tales about a host of fantastic spirits that prowl about at night. They are merely blaspheming the gods and making cowards of their children. None of these things should be allowed. Then, if the gods are themselves unchangeable, will they use their power to deceive us into thinking that they appear in all sorts of disguises? They might, I suppose. Come, said I, can God want to disguise himself and deceive us, either in word or action? I don't know, he replied. But, I asked, don't you know that the gods and men all detest true falsehood, if I may so describe it? I don't understand. I mean that in things which touch most nearly the most important part of him, no man really wants to be deceived, but is terrified of it. I still don't understand. Because you think I'm talking about something mysterious, I answered. But all I mean is that no one wants to be deceived in his own mind about things and not know the truth. That's where men are least ready to put up with falsehood and detest it most. Yes, I agree with that. But surely, when a man is deceived in his own mind about something, we can fairly call his ignorance of the truth true falsehood, for a false statement is merely some kind of representation of a state of mind, an expression consequent on it, and not the original unadulterated falsehood. Don't you agree? Yes. So real falsehood is detested by gods and men. I agree. But what about spoken falsehood? Is it not sometimes and on some occasions useful and not so utterly detestable? We can use it, for example, as a kind of preventive medicine against our enemies, or when one of our friends tries to do something wrong from madness or folly. And we can make use of it in the myths we are engaged in discussing. We don't know the truth about the past, but we can invent a fiction as like it as may be. That is perfectly true. In which of these ways is falsehood of use to God? Does he need to make up fictions because he does not know the past? No, that is absurd. So God is not the author of poetic functions? No. Does he tell lies because he is afraid of his enemies then? Certainly not. Or because of the folly or madness of any of his friends? God loves neither the foolish or the mad, he replied. God has, then, no reason to tell lies, and we conclude that there is no falsehood at all in the realm of the spiritual and divine. Most certainly. God is therefore without deceit or falsehood in action or in word. He does not change himself, nor deceive others, awake or dreaming, with visions or signs or words. I agree entirely with what you say. Do you agree then that the second principle to be followed in all that is said or written about the gods is that they shall not be represented as using magic disguises or fraud to deceive us in any way? I agree. And so, among the many things we admire in Homer, we shall not include the dreams Zeus sent to Agamemnon, nor shall we admire Aeschylus when he makes Thetis say that Apollo sang at a wedding in praise of her child, promising him a long life from sickness free and every blessing. His triumphant praise rejoiced my heart. Those lips I thought divine, flowering with prophecy, must God's promise speak. Yet he, the speaker, he, our wedding guest, Phoebus Apollo, prophet, slew my son. If a poet says this sort of thing about the gods, we shall be angry and refuse to let him produce this play, nor shall we allow it to be used to educate our children. That is, if our guardians are to grow up God-fearing and holy, so far as that is humanly possible. I entirely agree with your principles, he said, and we can treat them as law. As far as religion is concerned, then, we have now outlined the sort of stories men ought and ought not to be brought up on if they are to honour the gods and their parents and know how important it is to love one another. And I think we are quite right, he said. But what if they are to be brave? Must we not add something that will give them the least possible fear of death? Will anyone who fears death ever be brave? Certainly not. And will anyone who believes in terrors in the afterlife be without fear of death, and prefer death in battle to defeat and slavery? No. It looks then as if we shall have to control those who write on this topic too. We must ask the poets to stop giving their present gloomy account of the afterlife, which is both untrue and unsuitable to produce a fighting spirit, and make them speak more favourably of it. I agree, he said. We must begin then, I said, by cutting out all passages such as the following. I would rather be a serf in the house of some landless man with little enough for himself to live on than king of all dead men that have done with life, or and exposed to mortal and immortalize the hateful chambers of decay that fill the gods themselves with horror. Or again, then it is true that something of us does survive even in the halls of Hades, but with no intellect at all, only the ghost and semblance of a man. And he alone has a mind to reason with, the rest are mere shadows flitting to and fro. And his disembodied soul took wing for the house of Hades, bewailing its lot and the youth and manhood that is left. And the spirit vanished like a wisp of smoke and went gibbering underground. And finally, clippering like bats that squeak and flutter in the depths of some mysterious cave when one of them has fallen from the rocky roof, loosing his hold on the clustered friends. With real discord, the company set out. We must ask Homer and the other poets to excuse us if we delete all passages of this kind. It is not that they are bad poetry or are not popular. Indeed, the better they are as poetry, the more unsuitable they are for the ears of children or grown-ups if they are to prefer death to slavery as free men should. I absolutely agree. We must get rid, too, of all these horrifying and frightening names in the underworld, the rivers of wailing and gloom, and the ghosts and corpses, and all other things of this kind, whose very names are enough to scare everyone who hears them. They may be useful for other purposes, but we are afraid they will scare our guardians and make them jumpy and nervous. And our anxiety is justified. We must get rid of them then, and require our poets to give us an account on the opposite lines. Clearly. We must also, I suppose, cut out pitiful laments by famous men. We must, he replied, if we are to be consistent. Let us see if we shall be justified. We agree surely that one good man does not think death holds any terror for another who is a friend of his, and so would hardly mourn him for as if he had suffered. when some such catastrophe overtakes him, will mourn it less and bear it more calmly than others. He will. So we should be quite right to cut out from our poetry lamentations by famous men. We can give them to the less reputable women characters, or to the bad men, whom those we are bringing up as guardians of our state will be ashamed to imitate. You are quite right. We shall therefore again request Homer and the poets not to describe Achilles, the son of a goddess, as sometimes lying on his side, sometimes on his back, and then again on his face, and then standing up and wandering aimlessly along the salt sea beach, or picking up the dark dust in both hands and pouring it on his head, with all the weeping and wailing the poet describes. Nor can we allow a Priam, who was closely related to the gods, to grovel in the dung and implore them all, calling on each man by his name. Still more emphatically shall we forbid the poets to represent the gods lamenting with words like, "Oh, misery me, the unhappy mother of the best of men," and least of all can we have them presuming to misrepresent the greatest of all gods by making him say, "I have a warm place in my heart for this man who is being chased before my eyes round the walls of Troy," and "Fate is unkind to me. Sarpedon, who I dearly love, is destined to be killed by Patroclus, son of Menoetius. For, my dear Dementus, if our young men take passages like these seriously and don't laugh at their absurdity, they are hardly likely to think this sort of thing unworthy of them as men, or to try to control the temptation to similar words and actions. They will feel no shame and show no endurance, but break into complaints and laments at the slightest provocation. That is quite true. But that is not the behaviour or argument that just required. We must trust it till someone produces a better one. Yes, we must. And surely we don't want our guardians to be too fond of laughter either. A disposition to violent laughter commonly means instability, and we must not therefore allow descriptions of reputable characters being overcome by laughter, and similar descriptions of gods are far less allowable. Far less, I agree. So we can't have Homer saying of the gods, and a fit of helpless laughter seized the happy gods as they watched the festers bustling up and down the hall. Your arguments won't allow that. Call it my argument if you like, he replied. In any event, we can't allow it. And surely we must value truthfulness highly, for if we were right when we said just now that falsehood is of no use to the gods and only useful to men as a kind of medicine, it's clearly a medicine that should be entrusted to doctors and not to laymen. Yes, it will not be for the rulers of our city then, if anyone, to deceive. It will be for the rulers of our city then, if anyone, to deceive citizen or enemy for the good of the state, and no one else must do so. And if any citizen lies to our rulers, we shall regard it as a still graver offence than it is for a patient to lie to his doctor, or for an athlete to lie to his trainer about his physical condition, or a sailor to his captain on any matter concerning the state of the ship or crew. And so if you find anyone else in our state telling lies, whether he be craftsman, prophet, physician, or shipwright, you will punish him for introducing a practice likely to capsize and wreck the ship of state. We must punish him if we are to be as good as our word. Then again we shall want our young men to be self-controlled. And for the mass of men does not self-control largely consist in obedience to their rulers and controlling their own desire for pleasures of eating, drinking, and sex? I agree. We should approve, therefore, the sort of thing that Homer makes Diomedes say, "Be quiet, man, and take your cue from me," and verses like those which follow it. The Achaeans move forward, breathing valour, in silent obedience to their officers. We shall indeed. But what about "you drunken sot with the eyes of a dog and the courage of a doe," and the lines that follow? Can we approve of them and other impertinences of the rank and file against their commanders in prose or verse? We cannot, for they are hardly likely to encourage the young to self-control, though we need not be surprised if they give pleasure in other ways. What do you think? I agree. story of how Zeus stayed awake when all the other gods and men were asleep, with some plan in mind, but forgot it easily enough when his desire was roused. He was indeed so struck by Hera's appearance that he wanted to make love to her on the spot without going indoors, saying that he had never wanted her so much since the days when they first used to make love without their parents' knowledge. And there's the story of Hephaestus trapping Ares and Aphrodite in similar proceedings. All these are most unsuitable, he commented emphatically. But when a poet tells or a dramatist presents tales of heroic endurance against odds, then we must give him an audience. For instance, when Homer makes Odysseus strike himself on the chest and call his heart to order, saying, "Patience, my heart, you have put up with fouler than this," we must certainly listen to him then. But we must not let him make his character mercenary or grasping. We cannot let a poet say, "The gods can be won with gifts, and so can the king's majesty." We cannot agree that Achilles' tutor Phoenix advised him properly when he told him not to stop being angry and help the Achaeans unless they brought him presents. Nor can we consent to regard Achilles as so grasping that he took Agamemnon's presents and refused to give up Hector's body unless it was paid a ransom. It would be quite wrong, he said, to approve of things of this sort. I say it without hesitation, because of Homer's authority, I said. But it is really wicked to say these things about Achilles, or to believe them when we hear them said. There are other examples. Achilles says to Apollo, "You have made a fool of me, Archer King, and are the most mischievous of gods. How much I should like to pay you out if I had the power." He refuses to trust the river's commander, who is a god, and is ready to fight him, and he parts with the lock of his hair that he had dedicated to the river's Spercheius and gives it to the dead Lord Patroclus. We can believe none of this, and we shall regard as untrue also the whole story of the dragging of the body of Hector around the tomb of Patroclus and the slaughter of prisoners at his pyre. We cannot, in fact, have our citizens believe that Achilles, whose mother was a goddess, and whose father Peleus was a man of the utmost self-control, and the grandson of Zeus, and who had in Chiron the wisest of schoolmasters, was so lacking in discipline that he combined in himself the two contrary and pestilential faults of grasping meanness about money and excessive arrogance to gods and men. "You are right," he said. "We must therefore neither believe nor allow the story of dreadful ravages of Theseus, son of Poseidon, and Pirithous, son of Zeus, or any of the other lies now told about the terrible and wicked things done by other sons of gods and by heroes. We must compel our poets to say either that they never did these things, or that they are not the sons of gods. We cannot allow them to assert both, and they must not try to persuade our young men that the gods are the source of evil, and that heroes are no better than ordinary mortals. That, as we have said, is a wicked lie, for we prove that no evil can originate with the gods. Of course. Moreover, such lies are positively harmful, for those who hear them will be lenient towards their own shortcomings if they believe that this sort of thing is, and always was, done by the relation of the gods, kindred of Zeus, to whom belongs the ancestral altar high in heaven on Ida's mount, and in whose veins still runs the blood of gods. We must put a stop to stories of this kind before they breed vicious habits in our young men. We certainly must. We have now dealt with the kind of things that should and should not be said about gods and demigods, heroes, and the life after death. If we ask what kind of literature still remains, the answer is presumably that which deals with human beings. Clearly, but we cannot deal with that topic at present. Why not? Because I am afraid that we shall find that poets and storytellers have expressed the most erroneous opinions about it. They have said that unjust men are often happy, and just men wretched, that wrongdoing pays if you can avoid being found out, and that justice is what suits someone else but is to our own disadvantage. We must forbid them to say this sort of thing, and require their poems and stories to have quite the opposite moral. must not agree, therefore, about the kind of thing that ought to be said about human life until we have defined justice and the advantages it brings to its possessor irrespective of appearances. Quite true. So much then for the subject matter of literature. We must next deal with its presentation, and so cover both context and form. To this Alimantus replied that he did not understand what I meant. Then I must explain, I said. Perhaps you will see it if I put it this way. Any story or poem deals with things past, present, or future, does it not? Yes, it must. And for the purpose it employs either simple narrative or representation, or a mixture of both. I'm still not quite clear. What do you mean? I'm afraid you are laughing at my obscurity, I said, so let me try to explain my meaning by confining myself to a particular example, like an incompetent lecturer. You know the beginning of the Iliad, where the poet says that Chryseis begs Agamemnon to release his daughter, and when Agamemnon gets angry and refuses, Chryseis calls down the wrath of the gods on the Greeks. Yes. Well, up to the words, he appealed to the whole Achaean army, and most of all to its two commanders, the sons of Atreus. The poet is speaking in his own person, and does not attempt to persuade us that the speaker is anyone but himself. But afterwards, he speaks in the person of Chryseis, and does his best to make us think that it is not Homer, but an aged priest who is talking. This is the way in which he constructs his narrative right through the Iliad and Odyssey. That is true enough, he said. So his narrative includes both speeches and passages between speeches, does it not? It does. And when he speaks in the person of someone else, may we not say that he is imitating as nearly as he can the manner of speech of the character concerned? And to imitate another person in speech or manner is to represent the person one is imitating. Yes, it is. This, then, is the way in which Homer and the other poets use representation in the course of their narrative. Yes, I understand. If, of course, the poet never pretended to be anyone but himself, his poetic narrative would be wholly devoid of representation. But to prevent any possibility of misunderstanding, I will explain how this can be done. Suppose that Homer, after telling how Chryseis came with his daughter's ransom to beg her back from the Achaeans, or rather their kings, had gone on not as if it were Chryseis speaking, but Homer. There would have been no representation, but only narrative. The passage would have been run as follows. I'm not a poet, so I shall give it in prose. The priest came and prayed to the gods that the gods would allow the Achaeans to capture Troy and return in safety, and begged the Achaeans to show their respect for the gods by releasing his daughter in exchange for the ransom. The others respected his request and agreed, but Agamemnon was angry and told him to go away now and never return. Otherwise, his scepter and priestly garlands might afford him no protection. And he said that he would not release his daughter before she grew old with him in Argos, and that if he wanted to go home safely, he had better go and not annoy him any more. The old man was afraid when he heard what Agamemnon said, and departed without a word. But when he had left the camp, he prayed earnestly to Apollo, calling on him by all his titles, and reminding him of all the services he had rendered him in building temples and paying sacrifices. And he begged him in his prayer that, in return, he would avenge his tears on the Achaeans with his arrows. That, I concluded, is how the passage would run in simple narrative without representation. I see, he replied. And so you will see, I went on, that the opposite of this is when a poet omits the sections between the speeches and relies entirely on dialogue. Yes, I understand, he answered. That is what happens in tragedy, for example. Exactly, I said. And I think I have now made clear what I failed to explain before, that poetry and fiction fall into three classes. First, that which employs representation only, tragedy and comedy, as you say. Secondly, that in which the poet speaks in his own person. The best example is lyric poetry. Thirdly, that which employs both methods, epic and various other kinds of poetry. Is that clear? Yes, I understand now what you were trying to say, he said. And you will remember that just before that, I said that we had settled the question of the subject matter and must now deal with that of form. Yes, I remember. What I meant then, I said, was that we must decide whether we should allow our poets to use representation in their narrative, and if so, to what extent and for what purpose, or whether we should forbid it entirely. I suspect, he replied, that you are wondering whether we should allow tragedy and comedy in our state or not. Maybe, I replied, or maybe the question is more far-reaching. I don't know yet. We must follow the argument and see where it leads us. Fair enough, he said. Do you think then, Adeimantus, that we want our guardians to be capable of playing many characters or not? Does it not follow from the principles we adopted earlier that one man does one job well, and that if he tries to take on a number of jobs, the division of effort will mean that he will fail to make his mark at any of them? The conclusion is unavoidable, and it will also apply to representation. A man cannot play many characters as well as he can one. No, he cannot. He will therefore be unable to do anything worthwhile at all well if he is to be a versatile character actor. For the same writers are incapable of equally good work even in two such closely allied forms of representation as comedy and tragedy. You did say there were forms of representation, did you not? Yes, and it's true that a man can't write both. Nor can the same people be reciters and actors, or actors in tragedy and comedy, all these being forms of representation. True. And we can subdivide human nature still further, and show that it is impossible to play many roles well, whether in real life or in representations of it on the stage. That's very true. But we argued originally that our guardians were to be freed from all forms of manual work, that their life's work was to be the provision of perfect freedom for our state, a task to which they were to devote all their energies. That, therefore, is the only role they must play in life or literature, and with this end in view, the only characters on which they must model themselves from their earliest years must be men of courage, self-control, independence, and religious principle. They must no more act a mean part than do a mean action or any other kind of wrong, for we soon reap the fruits of literature in life, and prolonged indulgence in any form of literature leaves its mark on the moral nature of a man, affecting not only the mind, but physical poise and intonation. That is very true, he replied. Since then we care for the moral welfare of our guardians, I said, we will not allow them to take the parts of women, young or old, for they are men, nor to represent them abusing their husbands or presumptuously quarrelling with heaven when they imagine themselves happy, or crying and complaining in misfortune. Far less can we permit representation of women in sickness or love or childbirth. We must forbid this sort of thing entirely, and the same is true of slaves, male or female, when they are behaving like slaves. Agreed. And of bad and cowardly characters whose behaviour is just the opposite of what we demand. They indulge in comic abuse and back-chat, drunk or sober, and say and do things that are an offence against themselves and their neighbours. Nor do I suppose we shall tolerate representations of actions or words of madmen. We must recognise that there are men and women who are mad and bad, but we cannot have them represented in poetry or drama. You are quite right, he said. Then can we tolerate representations of smiths or craftsmen at work, or men rowing triremes, or in command of them? No, because none of these are occupations to which our guardians should pay any attention. And what about horses neighing, and bulls bellowing, and rivers splashing, and the sea roaring, and thunders rolling, and so on? We have already forbidden madness and the representation of madness, he replied. What you mean, I suppose, is that there is one style of narrative which the good man will employ when he has anything to say, and a different style in which the man of opposite character and upbringing will always choose to express himself. Describe them, he said. I think, he replied, that a decent man, when he comes in the course of a narrative to a speech or action by a good man, will be willing to impersonate him, and feel no shame at so doing. This will be especially true if he is representing the good man behaving with steadiness and determination, and only failing in a few respects and to a limited degree, owing to illness or love or drink or some other misfortune. But if he comes across an unworthy character, he will be ashamed to imitate it seriously, except perhaps for its short periods of good behaviour, because it falls below his standards. He has no practice in such representation, and will not consent to model himself on characters which his judgment despises as lower than his own, except perhaps for the purpose of amusement. Very likely. He will, in fact, make use of the form of narrative which we mentioned when we were talking of Homer's epics a few minutes ago, and will combine both representation and narrative, but the propagation of representation will be small. Or am I wrong? No, that's just the kind of way in which he will express himself. And other types of man will be all the readier to vary their style the worse they are, and will think nothing beneath them. They will seriously try to represent in public all the things we were talking about. We shall have the noises of thunder and wind and hail, and of axles and wheels, the notes of trumpets, pipes, whistles, and every possible instrument, the barking of dogs, the baaing of sheep, the twittering of birds. All these will be represented with voice and gesture, and narrative will play but a small part. That follows too. These, then, are the two styles of expression to which I referred, I said. Yes, I see, he replied. And of these two styles, one is pretty uniform, needing merely music of appropriate mode and rhythm to accompany it. In fact, if one handles it rightly, one and the same mode can be employed throughout, because of the uniformity of the style, and the same is true of the rhythm. That is certainly true, he said. The other style, on the other hand, will have the opposite requirements. It will need every kind of mode and every kind of rhythm if it is to find suitable expression, for its variety is unlimited. That is true too, but must not all poets and writers go in for one or other of these two styles or some combination of them? They must. What are we to do? I asked. Are we to admit both styles and the combination into our city, or pick on one of them? My own vote, he replied. We go to the style which represents the good man. And yet, Adeimantus, I reminded him, the combination of the two styles is very pleasant, and the opposite style to the one you have chosen gives the most pleasure of all to children and to nurses and the general public. Yes, if pleasure's what they're after. But perhaps you will say that it is unsuitable for our state, because there one man does one job and does not play a multiplicity of roles. It certainly is unsuitable. And so ours is the only state in which we shall find, for example, the shoemaker sticking to his shoemaking and not turning pilot as well, the farmer sticking to his farming and not taking on court work into the bargain, and the soldier sticking to his soldiering and not running a business on the side. Yes. So, if we are visited in our state by someone who has the skill to transform himself into all sorts of characters and represents all sorts of things, and he wants to show off himself and his poems to us, we shall treat him with all the reverence due to a priest and a giver of rare pleasure, but shall tell him that he and his kind have no place in our city, being forbidden by our code, and send him elsewhere, after anointing him with myrrh and crowning him. For ourselves, we shall, for our own good employ storytellers and poets who are severe rather than amusing, who follow the style of the good man, and in all their works abide by the principles we laid down for them when we started out on this attempt to educate our military class. That undoubtedly is what we should do, he said, if we had the choice. And I think, said I, that probability completes our survey of the literature to be employed in our education, because we have dealt both with subject matter and with form. I agree, he replied. Then we are left with the varieties of music and song to discuss, I went on, and I suppose that it's pretty obvious to everyone what requirements we shall have to make about them if we are to be consistent. Glaucon laughed. I'm afraid I'm not included in your everyone, he said, for at the moment I can't really suggest what we ought to say, though I'm not without my suspicions. Well, at any rate, you can agree easily enough that song consists of three elements: words, mode, and rhythm. Yes, I agree to that. As As far as the words are concerned, then, the same rules will apply as those we laid down for words not set to music, both for their content and form. True. And surely the mode and rhythm should suit the words. Certainly. But we agreed to ban dirges and laments, did we not? We did. Tell me then, you are a musician. Which are the modes suitable for dirges? The Mixolydian and the Extremelydian. Then we can reject them, I said. Even women, if they are respectable, have no use for them, let alone men. Quite right. But drunkenness, softness, or idleness are also qualities most unsuitable in a guardian. Of course. What then are the relaxing modes and the ones we use for drinking songs? The Ionian and certain Lydian modes, commonly described as languid. Will they then, I asked, be of any use for training soldiers? None at all, he replied. You seem to be left with the Dorian and Phrygian. I'm no expert on modes, said I, but I want one that will represent appropriately the voice and accent of a brave man on military service or any dangerous undertaking, who faces injury, defeat, or death, or any other misfortune with the same steadfast endurance. And I want another mode to represent him in the ordinary voluntary occupations of peacetime. For instance, persuading someone to grant a request, praying to God, or instructing or admonishing his neighbour, or again submitting himself to the requests or instructions or persuasions of others, and in all showing no conceit, but moderation and common sense, and willingness to accept the outcome. Give me these two modes, one stern, one pleasant, to express courage and moderation in good fortune or in bad. The two modes you are asking for, he rejoined, are the two I have just mentioned. And so, I went on, we shan't need for our music and song instruments of many strings with wide harmonic range. We shan't keep craftsmen to make instruments of this kind, such as harps and harpsichords. I suppose not. Then shall we allow flutes and flute makers in our city? Has not the flute the widest range of all, being in fact the original which other instruments of wide range imitate? That's plain enough, he said. We are left then with the lyre and the cithara for use in our city, though the shepherds in the country might have some sort of pipe. That seems to be the conclusion of our argument. We aren't really doing anything revolutionary, you know, I said, in preferring Apollo and his instruments to Marsyas and his. No, I quite agree, he replied. And what is more, I pointed out, we are insensibly getting rid of the luxury from which we said our state suffered. Quite right too, he replied. Well, let us continue the process, said I. After mode, we should presumably deal next with rhythm. We shan't want very elaborate or varied combinations, but merely need to find which rhythm suits a life of courage and discipline. We shall then adapt the metre and tune to the appropriate words, and not the words to the metre and tune. But it's your business to say what these rhythms are, as you did with the modes. I'm afraid I really can't do that, he replied. There are three basic types of rhythm, from which the various combinations are built up, just as there are four elements which go to build up the modes. So much I know and can tell you, but which are suited to represent which kind of life, I cannot say. Well, we'll consult Damon about it, I said, and ask him what combinations are suitable to express meanness, insolence, madness, and other evil characteristics, and which rhythms we must keep to express their opposites. I seem to remember hearing him talk about march rhythms and composite rhythms, dactyls and heroics, arranging them in various ways and marking the stresses. He talked also, I think, about iambics and trochees, and assigned them longs and shorts, and I believe that he praised or blamed the composition of the foot as well as the rhythm as a whole, or perhaps it was the combination of the two. I really can't remember. In any case, as I said, we can refer to Damon, for it would need a lot of argument to settle the details, don't you think? It would indeed. But there is one thing we can decide at once: the beauty and ugliness result from good rhythm and bad. That is undeniable, and good rhythm is the consequence of music that suits good poetry, same is true of mode and tune. If, as we said a moment ago, both the rhythm and mode should be suited to the words and not vice versa. The words must of course be determine the music, he said. But what about the style and content of the poetry themselves, I asked. Don't they depend on character, just as other things depend on them? They must. Good literature, therefore, and good music and beauty of form generally all depend on goodness of character. Well, I don't mean that lack of awareness of the world which we politely call goodness, but a character of real judgment and principle. I quite agree. And are not these things which our young men must try to acquire if they are to perform their function in life properly? They must. And are they to be seen in painting and similar arts, or weaving and embroidery, in architecture and furniture, and in living things, animals and plants? For in all of these we find beauty and ugliness of form and disharmony are akin to bad art and bad character, and their opposites are akin to and represent good character and discipline. That is perfectly true. Is it not only the poets, therefore, that we must issue orders requiring them to represent good character in their poems, or not to write at all? We must issue similar orders to all artists and prevent them portraying bad character, ill discipline, meanness, or ugliness in painting, sculpture, architecture, or any work of art, and if they are unable to comply, they must be forbidden to practice their art. We shall thus prevent our guardians being brought up among representations of what is evil, and so, day by day, and little by little, by feeding it, as it were, in an unhealthy pasture, insensibly doing themselves great psychological damage. Our artists and craftsmen must be capable of perceiving the real nature of what is good and beautiful, and then our young men, living as it were in good climate, will benefit because all the works of art they see and hear influence them for good, like the breezes for some healthy country, insensibly moulding them into sympathy and conformity with what is rational and right. That would indeed be the best way to bring them up. And that, my dear Glaucon, I said, is why this stage of education is crucial, for rhythm and harmony penetrate deeply into the mind and have a most powerful effect on it. And if education is good, bring balance of fairness. If it is bad, the reverse. And moreover, the proper training we propose to give will make a man quick to perceive the shortcomings of works of art or nature, whose ugliness he will rightly dislike. Anything beautiful he will welcome, and he will accept and assimilate it for his own good. Anything ugly he will rightly condemn and dislike, even when he is still young, and cannot understand the reason for so doing. While, when reason comes, he will recognize and welcome her as a familiar friend because of his education. In my view, he said, that is the purpose of this stage of education. Well then, I went on, when we were learning to read, we were not satisfied until we could recognize the letters of the alphabet wherever they occurred. We did not think them beneath our notice in large words or small, but tried to recognize them everywhere on the grounds that we should not have learned to read till we could. That is true, and we can't recognize reflections of the letters in water or in a mirror till we know the letters themselves. The same process of learning gives us skill to recognize both. Yes, it does. Then I must surely be right in saying that we shall not be properly educated ourselves, nor will the guardians whom we are training, until we can recognize the qualities of discipline, courage, generosity, greatness of mind, and others akin to them, as well as their opposites, in all their many manifestations. We must be able to perceive both the qualities themselves and representations of them wherever they occur, and must not despise instances, great or small, but reckon that the same process of learning gives us skill to recognize both. You are most certainly right, he agreed. And is not the fairest sight of all, I asked, for him who has eyes to see it, the combination in the same person of good character and good looks to match them, each bearing the same stamp? It is indeed, and such a combination will also be most attractive, will it not? Certainly. It is then with people of this sort that the educated man will fall in love. Where the combination is imperfect, he will not be attracted. it's a physical defect, he will not let it be a part of his affection. I know, I said, you've got, or once had, a boyfriend like that, and I agree with you. But tell me, does excessive pleasure go with self-control and moderation? Certainly not. Excessive pleasure breaks down one's control just as much as excessive pain. Does it go with other kinds of goodness? No. Then does it go with excess and indiscipline? Certainly. And is there any greater or keener pleasure than that of sex? No, nor any more frenzied. But to love rightly is to love what is beautiful and good with discipline and intelligence. I entirely agree. Then can true love have any contact with frenzy or excess of any kind? It can have none. It can therefore have no contact with this sexual pleasure, and lovers whose love is true must neither of them indulge in it. They certainly must not, Socrates, he replied emphatically. And so I suppose they will lay down laws in the states we are founding which will allow a lover to associate with his boyfriend and kiss him and touch him if he permits it, as a father does his son, if his motives are good, but to require that his association with anyone he's fond of must never give rise to the least suspicion of anything beyond this. Otherwise he will be thought of a man of no taste or education. That is how I should legislate. And that, I think, said I, concludes what we have to say about this stage of education.